Welcome everyone to the 20th expert discussion series on justice, tolerance, and peace building in Afghanistan. I am Rabia Salihi, and I will be facilitating the discussion today. Today we have Ms. Farkhondeh Akbari and Ms. Kobra Moradi with us, who have kindly taken the time to join us for a discussion about transitional justice in peace settlements and the lessons we can learn from other conflict situations. Ms. Farkhondeh is a PhD candidate at the Australian National University, and her research focuses on diplomacy and prospects of peace with non-state armed actors. And she has conducted multiple researches both in Afghanistan and Cambodia. And we also have Ms. Kobra, who is currently studying her master's in international law and diplomacy at the Australian National University again, with a focus on transitional justice. She is a contributor to the International Criminal Law Media Review, and she has also produced multiple case studies and literature for Afghanistan Human Rights and Democracy Organization. Okay, so just to introduce a little bit about the topic and what we will be discussing, a very short introduction about transitional justice, which our colleagues will later elaborate more on them. Transitional justice involves a broad range of retributive and restorative measures as a response to systematic and widespread violation of human rights in conflict situations. It does not have a standard template and can take on different forms in each conflict context, which depends on a number of factors, including the willingness of conflict parties, active role of the civil society, and regional and international support. Regardless of what form it takes, the key objective always stays the same, which is to help transition from conflict to a sustainable peace. And it can be, transitional justice can help a successful transition in several ways, which includes creating legitimacy and also mobilizing public support for a peace agreement. And it can help create a framework and opportunities for reconciliation. It can create or strengthen rules, norms, and values for lawful conduct of violence. And also it can contribute to development of an accountable and responsive post-conflict governance system. And most importantly, it can help deter and prevent recurrence of conflict. However, what's important for us that more recently, participation of victims of war, a group most affected by conflict in the peace process and construction of peace agreement, has emerged as a novel aspect of the transitional justice. They do not want to stay as mere subjects of discussion in peace negotiations and agreements, and rather they recently take more active role and actively support the transition. An example of this can be Colombia, which our colleague will discuss further. And also in relation to the role of AHRDO in Afghanistan, the organization has developed a victim-centered approach to durable peace building. And within this framework, victims and their issues constitute the center of gravity for the peace negotiation process, and also to help this approach translate into action. AHRDO has recently established victim-centered peace networks in 8 regions of Afghanistan. And these regional networks have established victim national networks, which which acts as an advocacy forum working towards direct and indirect participation of victims in the Afghan peace negotiation process. However, despite all these efforts, conditions for the transitional justice have proven to be difficult in Afghanistan, and the government has had a very disappointing track record and consistently obstructed important steps towards transitional justice, especially since 2001. Under the rule of Hamid Karzai, the Action Plan for Peace, Justice and Reconciliation, which was built on findings of a national consultation conducted in 2005, by the AHRC was discarded. And also there was an amnesty law in 2008 that was approved in 2008. This law granted blanket amnesty, not only to the past, but also future crimes. And recently under Ashraf Ghani's government, there has been attempts to obstruct investigation of serious crimes by the International Criminal Court about the Afghanistan situation. In most recent attempt, the most recent attempt on their case has been to obstruct the court and ask them for deferral of the investigation in Afghanistan, arguing that interferes with the peace efforts. Okay, so less on my side, but I want to give the floor to our speakers today. First, Ms. Farkhondeh will join us. And after the discussions, we will also have a question and answer session. So the audience are most welcome to write their questions in the chat box, or you can send me directly. Thank you. Yes, Ms. Farkhondeh.
Yes. Thank you, Rabia. I would like to first thank the Afghanistan Human Rights and Democracy Organization for organizing today's panel, and also take the opportunity to pay my tribute to all victims of war in Afghanistan. Today, I will be mainly talking on the nature of a political peace settlement and how it compels for justice to be neglected. I will then discuss some of the protective measures to be in place to avoid reoccurrence of past crimes in the future, and share some thoughts from Cambodia, and conclude with the Afghan affairs today. To avoid overlap with Kobra's area on the scope and work of transitional justice, my focus will be only on peace settlement aspect of the theme of today's discussion. I'll begin with defining a political peace settlement, which is broadly a negotiated set of terms between conflicting actors to bring dispute to an end and prevent future ones from occurring. Political peace settlement is different from a settlement where a conflict is won militarily by either side of conflicting actors, or a settlement that is imposed by third-party peace, which is enforced on the conflicting actors to negotiate. This is important to note because it relates to why in a political peace settlement, justice is often neglected. In a settlement, political settlement, strictly means that there is no winner of the conflict, something that reflects today's Afghanistan, where consensus has emerged that the conflict has to be settled politically after a military stalemate, and neither side is winning. The war is on, but they cannot move forward from there for either side to take over completely. The central feature of a peace settlement is, in general, focus on future organization of the political power, and the agreement that emerge from negotiating may differ in scope and content based on the context of the conflict and the countries that we are talking about. But a comprehensive agreement as an outcome of a settlement typically includes provisions that set out details of the process in exercise of power, transitional period, arrangements of an election if there is going to be one, and rewriting and amending the constitution, institutional setup, demobilization, reintegration of the fighting force, and the returns of the refugees, etc. Having in mind that this is occurring in the background of a conflict that has violated human rights. Civilians probably have suffered loss of life, persecution, mass murders, indiscriminate killing, or even other social and economic disadvantages. So peace agreements that emerge from a violent armed conflict are often taunted for ignoring justice and the rights of victims. In other words, there's a clash between ending violence and conflict versus human rights advocacy for finding accountability. for serious crimes committed during the war, because that settlement period where the negotiation is occurring, it is providing a space for such discussion to occur where it cannot occur in a conflict. But the argument is that to neglect justice is that because it is because that actors will not commit to a peace settlement when they're told that they will be sent to trial for violation of rights during the conflict, or actors would disagree to disarm or demobilize in exchange for prison cell. I'm mentioning this in noting that there is still military power by actors. So there are two categories of people in peace processes, or two body of thoughts about this discussion. One category is those who aim, and the principle are that the protection of human rights to ensure justice for victims, and the second category is the peacemakers or the negotiators and the facilitators to end the conflict. Peacemakers worry that the call for justice is a big hurdle when peace is not reached, and advocacy for prioritizing peace over justice. And they argue that justice can follow once peace is reached. And here, by peace, we strictly mean a negative peace, an absence of violence. Lakhdar Brahimi, when he was the United Nations Special Envoy for Afghanistan, stated once that one could either have peace or justice. The brutal truth is that justice is costly when peace is necessary. An agreement is an agreement that emerges from a peace settlement is what conflicting actors can agree upon. And for it to result in cessation of violence is primary to them than an ideal sense where justice could be served. But the paradox is how to obtain sufficient peace or sufficient justice without dismantling the possibility of peace. That is to find context-specific solutions and move on from this black and white approaches to peace and justice, or peace versus justice, because it will only bring positive result in the long term when we have justice complementing peace at the same time. This is an area of work that has been done in very recent years. But it's still, there's a lot of gap there internationally. There are many other ways to involve victims of war directly in a peace settlement process beyond symbolic gestures, but focus less on the less politicized issues. The scope of transitional justice is beyond trials, and it could look into truth-seeking, victim recovery, reintegration of the enemy's armed force in the society. There have been identified as ways that can work as recovery path that can lead to stability beyond trials and beyond that top-down approach. I think Kobra might talk about this area more. But moving on from addressing justice for crimes committed during the war, but what can be done in a peace settlement to avoid future violation of rights and the reputation of crimes. It is worth remembering Avishai Margalit's concept on rotten compromise. I have written about him before, where he warns negotiators to be aware of making a rotten compromise in a negotiation, even if it's for the sake of peace. Rotten compromise is defined as an agreement to establish or maintain an inhuman regime, a regime of cruelty and humiliation, a regime that does not treat humans as humans. A rotten compromise also can have two sides, an active side and a passive side. The active is that inhuman regime, and the passive is other actors that gives legitimacy and prolong that human actor to be that inhuman actor to sign a peace agreement with them, legitimize them, and let them to continue violating rights. We also know from peace settlement studies that all peace settlements don't bring peace. Some sow the seeds of future war. 1/3 of peace agreements fall apart and actors resume back to violence. The percentage is even higher when we deal with ideological and non-state armed actors. This is why it is necessary that in peace settlement mechanisms are installed to hold actors accountable and obligated to the agreement and that they have signed. It can work as a control mechanism to limit the risk of the reputation of the crimes of the past in the future. Law can play a key role here in some aspect of the settlement by regulating peace agreement and the issue that is covered in that agreement. If peace agreements are regulated, it can form a legal document in nature, and it can influence implementation and enforcement phase of the agreement. But we also know that the role of international law is limited due to the geopolitical interest, the politicization of international law, and the lack of political will to enforce those. But in an intra-state conflict, agreement is implemented domestically in nature, and it's bound to domestic regulation, and that's why it falls outside that definition of treaty in international law that we could sort of codify a legal aspect in it. But another way to bind non-state armed actor to an agreement through international law would be to bind state actors that support or has engagement with the domestic actor. So if peace agreements in intra-state settlement involve other states that have a stake in the conflict too, must become a signatory. And this can raise the agreement from a domestic to international scope. Agreements can be categorized legally based on the language used, the obligation laid, and responsibilities distributed to determine its legal status. An example in the case of Afghanistan would be that if any peace agreement signed with the Taliban, having Pakistan as signatory and formalizing its relation with the Taliban would be a step towards obligating Pakistan legally to be bound to the agreement, and if breached, face international scrutiny and consequences. Now that agreement, of course, it's a negotiated agreement. Actors involved in the conflict have to go through that phase of negotiation and to all the details to negotiate. But once the agreement is reached, all sides sign to it, having that international signatory, international actor as signatory can be helpful to sort of be more strict about obligation being fulfilled. Also, the UN Security Council resolution is another way of achieving a binding legal agreement when making a peace agreement with non-state armed actors. The obligation that is locked in a resolution can compel parties to agreements towards commitments. It can establish monitoring and compliance mechanism by the Security Council members endorsing the agreement, and also putting in place required monitoring and reporting from the signatories of that agreement. This can be a safety net to support peace and discourage actors from returning back to violence. Noting that how many peace settlements falls apart, the role of guarantor becomes crucial for implementation of peace agreement. When conflicting actors sign an agreement, a third party is commonly selected to act as a guarantor or observer or enforcer. It can have different names, but the key obstacle to achieve a constructive peace is when you look at the other peace settlement, it's the lack of guarantees in the enforcement and implementation phase of the peace agreement. reaching a peace agreement is one thing, but implementation is the hardest bit, we believe. So if there are mechanisms in place that are internationally recognized, it can punish defectors from the agreement and ensure that commitments towards the agreement, and also hold those accountable if they don't. In Afghanistan, we have quite a few examples of how the absence or the failure of a guarantor lead to violence and the reputation of crimes. One example is the US-Soviet failure to act in their role as guarantors for the 1988 Geneva Convention or Geneva Accords. And just recently, the absence of guarantor to observe the components of US-Taliban agreement has caused a lot of challenge with Taliban's compliance to the agreement, which is leading us to the crisis that we are today, because according to the Taliban, they have fulfilled all their commitments, but other actors claim that they have not. Here, if we had a third party as a guarantor to monitor, and that guarantor had to be agreed upon by both parties, it would have brought a lot more clarity. Since today's talk is on the lessons learned, I would now briefly reflect on peace settlement with Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. This is where I have conducted some of my research there. I will briefly go through the history very quickly, and just to give you a grasp of how this whole thing looked like when it was applied in Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge was probably a group that committed the worst genocide of the 20th century. Inspired by communist ideals, the guerrilla group took over Cambodia in April 1975 to January 1979. In the span of 3-4 years, they dismantled and destroyed Cambodia, and as a result, more than 1 to 2 million people were killed, executed, starved, and worked to death from the 7 million population. The Khmer Rouge regime, which was known back then as Democratic Cambodia, was ousted by the Soviet-backed Vietnamese forces, perhaps exactly a year before the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, December 1978 and December 1979. For 10 years, 4 factions fought while there was a Vietnamese-backed government in Phnom Penh. 10 years later, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the geostrategic considerations compelled regional international actors involved in Cambodian conflict to pave the way for a peace settlement to occur between that 4 fighting factions. Each factions were backed by one of the regional and international power. Khmer Rouge was considered probably the most coherent armed group compared to the other ones. But because they had committed a genocide, it stated too strong on their way, or the internationals couldn't just brush it off like all other ones who have committed crime, to include them in the peace settlement amnesty. But here China played a critical role as a supporter of the Khmer Rouge to neutralize the atmosphere of peace settlement negotiations. And they always objected on labeling of genocidal language in that time. The literature on Cambodia, there is a division on 2 divided camps about the question of neutrality towards Khmer Rouge. There was argument that neutralization of the conflict and actors involved in the conflict would help to ease the tension and reach a peace agreement. So in the end, the debate favored Khmer Rouge, and the term genocide was not used in the Paris Peace Agreement. The term instead settled on something similar to non-repeating of the actions of the past. It was a lot soft language used, which is considered as an insult to the victims and the mass atrocity crime that they committed. but considered as a price paid. Was the price paid for peace. Although the Khmer Rouge withdrew from that peace agreement after a year and a half, and then they resumed back to fighting until the dismantling of the whole organization in 1997. The Cambodian case, even though it was the UN's most comprehensive and sophisticated peace-building mandate, it lacked addressing justice. It lacked an effective monitoring mechanism in place to oversee the implementation of the peace agreement meaningfully. UN was there for about, I think about 3 years, but the plan was made in the Secretariat in New York and failed to adopt to the reality on the ground as Khmer Rouge resumed back to violence, and then other faction failed to implement their obligation of the agreement in a meaningful way. And today in Cambodia, the violence is absent. It's developing slowly. Prime Minister Hun Sen, who was one of the leaders of the faction, he has been in power for 38 years, and he have won every election since 1993. This is just an example of how, when there are not strong international guarantoring mechanisms to sort of oversee peace agreements, what can go wrong on the ground, because you can set everything right before the agreement is signed, but in the implementation, dynamics changes, power changes, and actors changes in the course of time. And there has to be, whatever is agreed in the agreement, it has to be able to sort of evolve and adopt with the reality on the ground. Going to the case in Afghanistan today, on coming back to our topic on victims of war, the 4 phases of Afghan conflict, the revolution of 1978 and occupation of the Soviet Union, governance of Mujahideen and the civil war, the brutal rule of the Taliban, and then the political arrangements. The political arrangements throughout these phases neglected justice for victims of war. As Rabia said, that there has been a really bad record, not just to the current government, but I think throughout the last 40 years. And also sitting here in Canberra, I cannot ignore the war crimes that the Australian soldiers committed that resulted in murders of civilians, including women and children. Now imagine the scale of war crimes and the depth of war crimes committed in Afghanistan in the last 20 years before our eyes, with the involvement of 43 other countries, 21 terrorist organizations, and daily loss of life by Taliban and the government forces. In one of my interviews with a well-known Afghan politician, when we were discussing the urgency of peace in Afghanistan, he asked me to imagine 2 million coffins of the bodies of the Afghan people lost in the last 40 years. If each coffin is 2 meters, it would make about 4,000 kilometers of coffins. And he said we can protect our borders or seal our borders with the coffins. This is how stark the loss of life and the victims of war is in Afghanistan. And in the current peace settlement scenario with Taliban, the focus is more, as we know, on the cessation of violence first. And then you know better than me as well in Kabul that the voice of victim is not meaningfully included in the process so far. The tragedy is that there is no guarantee that this process can settle the conflict and prevent the spill of more blood and add those more coffins. It's extremely crucial to focus on international mechanisms to be in place in any Afghan peace settlement to protect rights and recurring of crimes of the past in the future. If we cannot do much about the past, at least we have there has to be mechanism in place to protect the future ones. The internal actors in Afghanistan either don't have the capacity or the political will to pay enough attention To the voice of victims and advocates for rights, I see the necessary need for international advocates to push for justice and prevention of right, while at the same time grappling the way to end violence in Afghanistan. From my observation, the European Union has been more vocal and clearer on the issue of rights throughout this process, and let's hope that other international actors with leverage on internal actors do fulfill their responsibilities. I will stop here, and then we can probably discuss more about the current issues in the Q&A session. Thank you. Sorry if I took too long.
Oh, that was all right. Thank you. Thank you very much for the very comprehensive and international and interesting analysis of both political peace settlements and also the case of Cambodia, and also an analysis in the context of Afghanistan. We will ask the questions, and also we have a comment and a question from our audience at the end. But for now, we can maybe give Kobra a chance to share her.
Thank you, Rabia, and also thank you to the Afghanistan Human Rights and Democracy Organization for creating this opportunity to discuss a topic that is usually very silent, but very crucial and important in the context of Afghanistan. I will begin by reiterating the definition of transitional justice, and then talk about the importance of pursuing transitional justice in peace negotiations, and then at the end finish with the need to reframe the peace versus justice narrative. So just to reiterate the definition of transitional justice as similarly to what Rabia defined in the beginning, transitional justice is often defined as processes or mechanisms that are used by societies that are in transition. So a state or a society that is moving from conflict to peace or repression to democracy, to address the large scale human rights abuses that has happened in the past or that are happening during the transition. For example, in the context of Afghanistan, as Afghanistan is negotiating a peace deal with the Taliban, the question arises, how do we deal with the atrocities that has happened in the past and the ongoing injustices and violations? Farkhondeh has highlighted the difficulties of pursuing justice at times of transition, and I would like to talk about why, despite these difficulties, it is important and necessary to advocate for transitional justice and try to achieve some sort of justice in the context of transition, including peace negotiations. Transitional justice is often takes place, or the conversation about transitional justice often arises, as Rabia and Farkhondeh stated before, in contexts where mass human rights violations have occurred, including large-scale killings, ethnic cleansing, torture, rape, and abductions, and other atrocities. So in this context, it is impossible to wipe the slate clean and say that we can now move on and forget about the past. There are many problems with this position and argument, that we can just simply forget the past for the sake of peace. Firstly, Farkhondeh highlighted the scale of crimes that have happened in Afghanistan, and the number of coffins and bodies and human lives that have been lost in this war. So this would be a grave to expect to simply forget the past, and to expect forgiveness is a grave injustice to the victims and their families. It's very unrealistic to ask someone who has been displaced, who has been tortured and have lost family to simply forget about the past for the sake of moving on. Moving on requires a process. Forgiveness requires a process, and there's a need to engage in different type of measures, such as acknowledgement and disclosure of the violations by the perpetrators, as well as apology in the circumstances where it's possible. Therefore, it's very unrealistic and to expect that victims and society as a whole can simply forget about its past and move on. And therefore, we have to find a way to address the legacies of past abuses, as well as the injustices and violations that are happening in the process of transition. And my second argument on this point is that a peace settlement that completely ignores ongoing violations and existing inequalities and injustices is unlikely to be legitimate, sustainable, and popular. And this is the case in Afghanistan. And given that the violations have an ethnic and religious lines and dynamics, there is so much grievances, there's so much fear, hatred, division, and mistrust between different groups. And these factors create an environment that leads to a cycle of violence that is never ending. Unfortunately, as highlighted by Rabia and Farkhondeh, in Afghanistan, we have not really sat down and asked the necessary questions. How did the war start? Why is it still continuing? Who are the perpetrators? What happened to the missing persons? Where are they? We haven't really been through a process of reconciliation in order to address mistrust and fear between different groups, and to establish and facilitate intergroup trust and confidence. Also, lack of accountability and simply providing amnesty to perpetrators of international crimes so that they can sit on the negotiation table and sign a peace deal encourages further violations. And this is particularly problematic given that, as Farkhondeh stated, most peace deals are, if there is no proper implementation process, are likely to fail. And providing lack of accountability and providing amnesty sets a very dangerous example and sends the signal to perpetrators and criminal networks that you can commit mass atrocity, you can carry out mass killings and violence with impunity, and then go and sit on a negotiation table without fear of ever being held into account. This furthers violence and encourages further victimization. And therefore, these are some of the reasons why, despite the complexity of pursuing justice at times of transition, it is necessary to push for transitional justice in peace negotiations. Unfortunately, generally, and also in Afghanistan, the narrative has so far been framed as justice versus peace, not justice and peace. The two has both justice and peace have been put against each other and is seen as two opposing objectives, where a society has to make a choice about whether it wants to choose peace or whether it wants to choose justice. And as discussed previously, in Afghanistan, justice has been sacrificed for the sake of peace, and the reasoning being that we don't want to spoil the peace process, because the negotiating parties, most of whom are accused of committing war crimes, are unlikely to sit on the negotiation table and discuss peace and sign on a peace deal that will, where they know that at the end they will be put in prison. But my argument is that this is the wrong framing, because it should not be about choosing between peace and justice, and because both are important and they can complement each other. And transitional justice is fundamentally about the challenges of pursuing justice in political transitions in very complex and difficult circumstances, including under the limitation of a peace process. Justice in transitional justice is not the same, is not defined in a similar way as justice is defined in the context in a peaceful society. For example, in a stable democratic state, if a person commits murder, there are established laws about that if they are put on trial and found to be guilty beyond reasonable doubt, then their punishment is very obvious. However, as discussed in the context of transitional justice, this is very difficult because there is the question of whether pursuing trials would limit the peace process. And so transitional justice, because each country, the conflict, the transition and its challenges are different, transitional justice does not prescribe a pre-existing justice formula that should be applied on all societies, regardless of the context. So the fundamental question in transitional justice is, what kind of justice is achievable under the circumstances on the ground, including considering the limitations imposed by the circumstances of the peace negotiation or by the peace process. And a good example of how to manage the dilemma between peace and justice is the case of Colombia. And in the Colombian peace process between the FARC rebel group and the Colombian government from 2012 to 2016, the FARC made it very clear that they would not negotiate a peace deal if at the end they know that they will be put on trial and their punishment would be imprisonment. And so the government of then President Juan Manuel Santos faced a very challenging circumstance, and rather than completely ignoring justice and saying, let's forget about justice, we can now talk about peace, his government asked, under this condition, what kind of justice is best achievable in these circumstances? We cannot go back to violence. We have to be able to achieve a peace settlement, but at the same time, the FARC does not want to go on trial and face imprisonment. And so, and he had the political will to find the answer to this question, and his government created a group that involved both representatives from the government and the FARC rebel group to negotiate on the details of justice. And at the end, they were able to reach an agreement, which was included in the final peace package. And they agreed, and it's written in the final peace agreement, that there won't be any amnesty for international crimes. However, given that the FARC would not accept an imprisonment, they negotiated an alternative justice or alternative sentencing, where perpetrators would be subject to reparative labor or some kind of restrictions on their liberty, however, not a prison term. However, two conditions were imposed to receiving this alternative sentencing. The first being that the perpetrator had to engage in truth-telling, so they had to confess their crimes and acknowledge full responsibility. And the second condition was that they had to engage in reparation project, for instance, assist with building schools, hospitals, and roads in victim communities, and especially in communities where they were responsible for committing atrocities and crimes. And this reparation project would take between 5 to 8 years. those who did not engage in truth-telling and reparative work, if they were put on trial and found guilty of committing international crimes, would be subjected to 15 to 20 years of imprisonment. Therefore, rather than completely ignoring justice within the difficulties of the peace negotiation and providing amnesty, the Cambodian peace negotiation was able to achieve some sort of justice, even although it was not a perfect justice. And this shows that, that rather than pitting justice and peace against each other, there is a need to look at ways of reconciling both and ask what kind of justice is achievable under the circumstances at this point in time. And I say at this point in time because while peace negotiations may have a limited period, the lifetime of transitional justice is very long. The word transition does not have like a time limitation, and there is no formula that transitional justice begins on X date and finish within 5 to 10 years. There is no such a restriction, and therefore transitional justice has a long lifetime. So while within the context of a peace settlement at that time, say trials is not possible, but informal transitional justice approaches may be possible. For example, transitional justice initiatives carried out by civil society groups. A good example here is the Afghanistan Human Rights and Democracy Organization, talking to victims, bringing victims together to create a victim narrative that is based on a rights-based approach, where victims have a right within the process of transition and can demand those rights. So if in the context of the peace process, trials is not possible, civil society and government and other actors can start the preparation for transitional justice. They can initiate truth-telling, and truth-telling does not have to happen from top-down approach. It can be a bottom-up approach initiated by civil society and human rights groups. And with that, I will end my talk. Thanks.
Thank you very much. That was very helpful in our understanding both about transitional justice and its role in the case of Afghanistan. Okay, so I think at this stage, I will ask a question from Farkhondeh, and then we also have a question from our audience. And so first, Farkhondeh Jan, I want to ask you, related to the context of Afghanistan, how to prevent recurrence of violence by the Taliban after the peace settlement, if you could please answer that.
I first hope that there would be a peace settlement. In that context, I think it's important to sort of be realistic on what's happening on the ground at the moment. The Taliban really got emboldened by the US-Taliban deal that was signed last year. It gave them that recognition, that courage, and that legitimacy, and then how that sort of boosted the morale of their fighters. But it did not reduce from their violence. As we know, that the Taliban have been very clear, although in very vague statement, that military takeover is their plan B. And we do know that when it's military takeover, it means a lot of violence, because knowing the unpopularity of the Taliban coming and purging through districts and villages, there will be resistance from different communities. And in each village, if you imagine we have 100 people killed, that raises the scale to something like genocide. So it's so important knowing that the urgency of peace settlement is there. It's very hot right now that Internationally, there is a consensus that we have to settle the conflict militarily. But what I see is lacking of how to avoid that recurrence of violence, and that is achieving some sort of strong international consensus on the principle of the non-return of the Taliban through force. That sends a strong message and a clear message to the Taliban that it is absolutely unacceptable by the international community for them to take over militarily, because as a result, more civilians will be killed. And international community has that leverage. We do know that the international community don't have the appetite of engaging in Afghanistan as they have in the last 20 years. They want to wind down their engagement or even leave, but I think the leverage lies on their diplomatic recognition. That's a leverage that could be used over the Taliban, that if there is a military takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban through force, they will not be recognized by international community. And we also know that recognition is a weakness of the Taliban. They were recognized by only 3 states before, and the fact that they're showing this diplomatic side of them and what we have seen in Doha in the last 2 years, they crave that recognition. And I think that should be enhanced more by international community and used as a leverage against the Taliban to sort of commit meaningfully to peace settlement, to a negotiation, and take that out of their mind that they can take over Afghanistan militarily. I think that will sort of be the first step that we need to put in place for protection of civilians. Yep, I'll stop here.
Thank you. I have another question, which I think you or Kobra, and if you can answer. We have a question from Anis Rizai, who has asked, given the nature of current wars and conflicts, particularly with regards to the involvement of transnational actors, what mechanisms do you think national actors should undertake in order to ensure transnational aggressors are also held to account for their crimes and violation of human rights? Would this even be plausible? And in relation to this, I think it's very related. Hila Najibullah has also asked something related to the Geneva Accords of 1988, which I think would be nice if she herself, she wants to ask it herself. So I will let her ask that question as well before you can move on to answering them. Yes, Hila. Yeah. Can we let Hila?
Can I answer part of the first question on the transnational aggressor, or as I addressed in my talk about the limitation of international law and how it's hard to sort of bind external or international actor and as well as internal actors. So it's all, when it comes to international law, it's all about the political will of parties involved. So I see a question here on the failure of the Geneva Accord, that Pakistan especially still had obligation there. But as I mentioned, the US and the Soviet Union and now the Russia sort of failed their role as guarantors. And there was no other mechanism in place to enforce them. I mean, you can't enforce them. They're the superpowers and they have power of veto in the National Security Council. The most powerful mandate that could come would be from the from the UN Security Council. And they themselves have the power of veto from the Security Council. And but with the Geneva Accord, Hila John herself might know a lot more about it. But I think the dynamics changed very quickly, and the geopolitical changes that occurred internationally and in the region, international actors with obligation moved on, and we were left on our own to fight, and we know the result of that. So my focus was that we have to try our best on the current issue to get international actors in some sort of a framework to have obligation to commit to whatever peace agreement we come up with, because we do have regional and international stakeholders in the Afghan conflict. The easiest would be to make them signatories to the agreement, but even that, if the political will is not there, that signatory wouldn't make sense much. But that's the first step, and that's what it's better than nothing. It can be one of the safety nets. I think it's a very weak area, and that's what I think our challenge is with the future. I will stop, and Kobra John can add more.
Thank you, Rabia, and thank you, Anis, for that question. Just to double check, it was about whether civil society activism can encourage or promote transnational justice.
That's the second question Anis has asked. I think the first is involvement of transnational actors and how we can hold them accountable for their aggressions.
Okay, thank you for that question. The international civil society and human rights groups, I think, can play a significant role in terms of international accountability. There's that at the moment, for example, in Europe, including in Germany, France, and Sweden, there's a lot of cases being brought up under the principle of universal jurisdiction against people who are involved in committing international crimes in Syria and elsewhere. And recently, the 3 human rights organizations in Europe brought a complaint against the Assad regime and their use of chemical weapons against civilian populations in Syria. And also under the principle of universal jurisdiction, and the German prosecution said that they will investigate the matter and see if there is any basis, any factual legal basis for pursuing further investigation. And I think the states, international actors such as states and civil society can play a significant role in demanding that states and states who are also engaged in proxy war are held accountable and are held accountable for their crimes, and demanding an answer, as well as ensuring that they do not repeat their support for proxies elsewhere in their commission of international crimes.
Thank you. Hilajan, if your question has not been answered yet, I'd like to give you the floor.
Yes, no, thank you very much for letting me ask my question. And what Farkhondeh John was saying is extremely important regarding the whole notion of that when a non-state actor is involved and backed by a state.
Okay, seems internet gave up. Okay, so I have a specific question from Kobra John, and after that I will read another question Anis has asked, and also one last question by Drakhshan. So first, I would like to ask you, given that prosecution is difficult to achieve, what other mechanisms are available for addressing past violations? And other than that, we have a question from Anis that either of you can answer. So what I think this was partly answered by you, Kobra John. Would civil society and grassroots activism like AHRDO be able to foster a space for normalization of conversion on victims of sexual violence? What transitional justice mechanisms are in place that ensure that victims of sexual violence, both men and women are included in the process, so that they can also exercise agency over the policy outcomes. And we have a comment versus or a question from Drakhshan, which is, I also would be interested to hear your thoughts on how we can address the issue of proxy wars being fought in Afghanistan and the foreign conversation. Okay, sorry. And the foreign funding of terrorism and extremism. She has also recommended a reading for us, which yeah, I think all the attendees can also see that. And Anis has, I think there was a typo, and it was not conversion, and instead conversation. You can, yeah. Now I will let you answer those. Thank you.
Thank you. Regarding the question on victims of sexual violence, I think a good example recently is the push by national and international civil society to ensure reparation for the victims of sexual violence connected to ISIS. And recently, so they have been carrying out this advocacy work for a few years now. And recently the Iraqi parliament passed a bill requiring the provision of reparation, including compensation, providing education to victims of sexual violence related to the crimes that were committed by ISIS. And this includes both men and women. That's a good example of how a network of national and international civil society actors can work together in order to ensure transitional justice for victims of war crimes. And in this case, reparation is a key, is one of the key mechanisms or objectives of transitional justice. Regarding the question on what other approaches are available for addressing past violations, given that prosecution is difficult, there are multiple other mechanisms, and some of them have already been discussed in this talk, including establishing a truth commission, creating or initiating memorialization, such as creating museum, which I think the Afghan Human Rights and Democracy Organization has done in their work, as well as encouraging institutional reform. And we talked about ensuring non-repetition to make sure that these type of crimes does not happen in the future. And institutional reform and vetting or illustration is an important component of that. And vetting requires that people who have been involved in international crimes do not hold any public office, including in the security sector. And that's fundamental to the objective of non-repetition. In South Africa, while amnesty was provided in order to secure a peaceful transition, that was exchanged for truth-seeking, and so perpetrators were required to disclose their crimes, and also there was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was established, also focused on healing and bringing society together. Other than the fact that trials is difficult to achieve, it's also limited in its scope, given that we're talking about countries where mass atrocities have occurred. There's a large number of victims, as well as large number of perpetrators. Unfortunately, trials, including domestic and international, are very expensive and timely. In the case of Cambodia, where I worked in 2019 and 2020, that was the case. As mentioned by Farkhondeh, the crimes occurred between 1975 and 1979 by the Khmer Rouge. And only 15 years later, after the Khmer Rouge were defeated, Prime Minister Hun Sen and his government decided to invite the UN to assist in establishing a court to prosecute senior leaders of the Khmer Rouge. and the court only began functioning, and it only began to start its work in 2006. So there's a large time gap between when the crimes happened, as well as, apologies, as well as when the crimes occurred and when the trials began on attempting to bring some sort of justice for the crimes. And also, the court only focuses on senior leaders and those most responsible. And the question arises, what about other perpetrators? What about other victims? And this is where other mechanisms are really important, including initiatives focusing on truth-seeking, on intergroup, creating intergroup trust, and memorialization. For example, in Cambodia, the S21, which was a prison center where people were tortured and killed, that has now been turned into a genocide museum in order to document the crimes, commemorate the victims and what happened, to educate the society, and also to preserve evidence. And this is why I think mechanisms other than trials are fundamental to the objective of achieving transitional justice.
Thank you. Okay, so Hila has sent her questions because she got disconnected. She has a question for Farkhondeh John and another one for you, Kobra. For Farkhondeh, it's what are the modalities of international agreements that have been successful in terms of implementation, and what factors did it have, and what are the multiple signatories? Who are the multiple signatories? And for Kobra John, it's the US remains one of the stakeholders in international crimes, yet it is the US that is facilitating the peace process. In a proxy conflict such as Afghanistan, how can you ensure justice, particularly transitional justice, that it's a part of the peace process if those in charge of the process are major violators of justice? And related to this question, we have another question from Mr. Mahdi Roshan Zamir. And he has asked about where does America, I mean, he means the US's interest lies. Is it continuation of war or peace? Yeah.
I will take the question on the proxy and Hila's question quickly, and then we maybe after Kobra we can get back to the next questions. On proxy, when talking about proxy in the context of Afghanistan, it's always the elephant in the room is Pakistan. So regardless of whatever is in the international law or in formalities, they sort of address this issue. But I think Afghanistan really need to address the issue of proxy. In Pakistan's interest in Pakistan's proxy in Afghanistan. We know that Pakistan has a strategic interest in Afghanistan for its security threats from India, and that need to be addressed for it to sort of be resolved or at least managed. It cannot be just sort of polished over, sign agreement, move on, because we know that Hizb Islami, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's Hizb Islami was Pakistan's boys. And once after that, they chose the Taliban as their proxy. So whatever phase of conflict it is, and things can change on, but unless and until that proxy dimension of the conflict is not addressed, there will always be another group arising up and sort of forwarding that strategic interest of our neighbor Pakistan. So I think it's really important that meaningful discussion take place, and it is meaningfully addressed as well. The previous Afghan governments have been apart from the Taliban side before that and post 2001 not very Pakistan friendly. but very close to India instead. Things were said, but they were not addressed and managed properly. So I think in a peace settlement, hopefully if we have one, that proxy dimension needs to be addressed in a meaningful way for the violence to end. And coming to Hila's question on modalities that can work about international actors in domestic conflict, I think first step would be formalizing relation between internal actor and the external actor, and then of course making them a signatory to the agreement, to commit to that agreement, and other ways would be putting on a strong guarantor mechanisms when for a peace agreement to be implemented in full. Guarantors is a very loose terms. It can be like a UN body like observing something, but by here guarantor I mean a body that has international legitimacy, that is accepted by internal actors, that has the power to change its action or to take action against actors on the ground once agreement is not being implemented. I think they are sort of the measures that can take place. And there was one last question, I think, on whether it's in US's interest for peace or war. Is that correct? I think internationally and overall, we know that we sort of get the sense that a peaceful Afghanistan is on everybody's interest. And for US being engaged in Afghanistan for 2 decades, it is debatable whether they have fought the Taliban willingly to get over them and to succeed in their fight in Afghanistan. That's a separate debate, but there were many factors that sort of led to the US's let's call it failure to defeat the Taliban completely as they wanted to. I think I do have this sense that all international actors, including US, feels that a peaceful Afghanistan is in the interests of the region and the world. But now how that peace is achieved and who is in power and how things play out domestically, I think that's another question. That's it, I think, from me.
Yes, Kobra.
Thanks. I will answer the question of whether given that the United States remains a stakeholder in the peace process, how can you ensure justice is part of the peace process? I think this whole discussion has been about the difficulty of ensuring transitional justice in peace negotiations. And of course, the US has been very silent on this topic. It did not include any language concerning human rights or justice in the peace deal that it signed with the Taliban. And given also that the fact that its own soldiers were involved in the commission of war crimes in Afghanistan, it's highly unlikely to pursue or to encourage that justice is included as part of the peace process. However, other actors, other states can, if they have the political will, can impose some sort of pressure, as well as the national and international civil society. Now, of course, at the national level, given the targeted killings that is going on at the moment, that's very difficult. So it falls on the international community, especially the international civil society and other states, to continue demanding that human rights concerns are a part of the peace process. And this was done in Colombia. There was a lot of civil society action that encouraged that victims' transitional justice concerns are included in the peace process, and ultimately both parties agreed to invite victim representatives to participate in the peace negotiations. Unfortunately, it's in Afghanistan. It's a very unfortunate situation, and it is very difficult to ensure that transitional justice is part of the process. So far, it has been sidelined. And now it really falls on whether there are other ways, informal ways of transitional justice. Bringing transitional justice in this space is not possible. What informal, the question would be, what informal approaches are there? And I think the Afghanistan Human Rights and Democracy Organization is doing a fantastic work by organizing forums like this, as well as by bringing victims together. And while that does not ensure a perfect transitional justice, at least there is something happening in order to start the conversation and begin a process of healing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the very informative discussions. And also thank you, our audience, for asking very critical questions, which kind of also contributed to the discussion. Okay, we have another question. Should I ask that? It's for the case of Colombia. This is the very last question, I promise. Okay, in the case of Colombia, the participation of victims in negotiations in the form of testimonial had transformative impact. Could you tell us more about this, and if this model could be used in Afghanistan?
I'm not an expert on Colombia. I just had done some research for the Afghanistan Human Rights and Democracy Organization. However, through the research that I did and reading about it, there was a major agreement that this was a very positive step, given that usually victim issues justice are sidelined in peace processes, the fact that the victims were able to participate in the process, and also the important thing was that it didn't just, the victims were selected by impartial actors such as Church and the United Nations. And so the victims' representatives were victims of a diverse range of crimes and victims of both state and non-state actors. And so that created this space where the victims' stories was not owned by either of the party. They were an impartial and neutral actor representing themselves on their behalf. And by ensuring that victims from both sides of the conflict is present, it made the subject of victims' rights and justice a neutral subject, and also that was complemented by the fact that justice was accountability, and justice was not just directed towards the FARC rebel groups. The state perpetrators were also subject to a similar kind of alternative sentencing that was provided to the FARC rebels, and that kind of like influenced and encouraged both sides to not shy away from discussing and ensuring that that justice and human rights issues are included in the peace agreement.
Thank you. Okay, I think we can wrap up now. Thank you very much for joining the discussions, and thank you for everyone who asked the questions, and to Maina Abbasi and Araf Yaqubi for their kind comments. And also in answer to Shabnam Abbasi's question on Facebook, we are going to upload this video later on Facebook, so it will be available for watching Yep. Thank you very much, Farkhondeh John and Kobra John, and have a great day, everyone.